Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the second day of the T20 Summit here. We are in Milano, we are at the Bocconi University. A warm welcome also to all of you that are following connected online on our platform. So today we're going to discuss the policy recommendation of the T20 on infrastructure and trade and on health. At the center of this session, there will be the curtain raiser speech, a well-awaited speech by the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva. But I do not want to anticipate too much because we are ready to start discussing how to deliver for people, planet, and prosperity. And we start with a conversation with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who's an international authority when it comes to sustainable development, in conversation with Samir Saran, who's president of the Observer Research Foundation from India. They are both already connected, so I leave the floor to Samir for kicking off the conversation. Welcome both.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here at the T20 Summit and to have partnered with ISPI through a very intricate and intensive program through this year, through the pandemic hit year. But I'm glad that we could all meet, convene, and discover ideas and solutions that may benefit us all. One of the most important themes, obviously, that we need to find responses to is on the infrastructure deficit, on building up habitats, building up communities, building up countries. And there could be no better person than Professor Jeffrey Sachs to speak about it. So welcome, Professor Sachs, to this conversation.
Thanks a lot. Great to be with you, Samir, and great to be part of the T20 process.
Professor Sachs, we know that infrastructure leads to economic growth and it leads to general prosperity. We also know how we build up in the future is going to shape the green transitions, is going to leave a footprint or respond to the climate challenge. How do you match the imperatives of prosperity and sustainability with the green imperative that all of us today must confront now?
I think the answer is that green and digital gives us guideposts for where we need to go, and the SDGs and the Paris Agreement give us an overarching framework. We do have to have a future energy system that is net zero emission, even negative emission in the second half of this century. And so the first guidepost is that as countries build their energy systems, they need to be building decarbonized energy systems, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, and the applications that go along with those primary energy sources. We know that digital can be a great friend, a leapfrog technology for development. It can bring people into systems of education, health, governance, finance, payments in ways that were not achievable even 5 or 10 years ago. I have tremendous hopes for what online education and telemedicine and other applications can mean for people who have really been essentially excluded from those public services in the past. The big challenge that I see repeatedly is the financing challenge, which is not so much what to build or even how to build it, but how to pay for it. When people are poor, savings are low, government revenues are low, and yet capital needs are enormous. And we need to find ways to invest ahead of the curve, understanding that those investments will, of course, be a key part of future economic development, and that in and of itself will help pay for those investments. I think one basic point, which is obvious, but I want to underscore it, is we need to invest simultaneously in infrastructure and in people. If we invest in electrification and digital, but not in children, in their health, nutrition, and education, we're going to come to a bad place in the end, where infrastructure might be there, but the skills won't be there to build the economic base on top of that infrastructure. So the biggest puzzle, in my view, in sum, is the financing puzzle. We have countries that need a lot of capital, both human and physical. The returns on that capital, socially, equitably, and in basic economic terms, I think will be enormous. But the financing is pretty brutal right now. The multilateral development finance system is a small fraction of what it really should be. The rich countries can borrow seemingly whatever they want at near zero interest rates, whereas poor countries are already facing debt crisis. They're facing exclusion from markets. They're facing 5 or 10% interest rates, whereas rich countries are at 0 to 2% interest rates. So I believe that a fundamental transformation of the financial architecture with a great deal more development financing, a much larger role of development banking, is crucial to build the green and digital infrastructure that we're really almost compelled to build as a framework for the future.
Professor Sachs, you in many ways identified the single most important area we need to focus on as a G20 group and also as a global community. Let me ask you about the second challenge that I see emerge in the previous years. There is also politics at play. Infrastructure is highly political. We have a Chinese system, the BRI. We have the EU-led the 10 effort. We have the US Build Back Better World and the Blue Dot Network. We have India's Sagarmala network. We have these competing infrastructure investment projects, programs, initiatives around the world. Many of them are vying for political relevance, political clout, are trying to shape ideologies, are trying to shape future trajectories of countries. Are we in age of confrontation around the infrastructure development of large parts of the world, or can we create complementarities? Are you an optimist on working together to build a world that benefits all?
I just have the image of the bridge. The BRI builds one half the bridge, Europe builds another half, and they don't connect, and we end up with the two worthless half bridges rather than connecting them together. You know, geopolitics is a bit of a fantasy land, unfortunately, right now. The United States says, even in its documents, we're the primary country. We need to keep our primacy. China's a challenge to the international system. This way of thinking about things is not only silly, to use a kind of silly word, but extraordinarily dangerous. The us versus them mentality, in the end, could get us all killed, to put it in a blunt way. We need a multipolar world, certainly. We need a world in which India, China, European Union, United States, African Union, and others are seeing each other as parts of an interconnected, multipolar world. The United States still has an illusion that it somehow runs something called the free world, whatever that is, and that it naturally dominates. It tries to build alliances. It goes to India, to Australia, to Japan, says we're the Quad so that we can oppose China. I'm against all this thinking, frankly, and I don't think in a naive way. I find this alliance thinking, this balance of power thinking, to be the naive part. Because as an economist, I look at the underlying data, I look at the demographics, I look at the technology, and I'm completely convinced no region can run the world, should run the world, need run the world, or will run the world. So in this sense, we should understand we are nodes of an interconnected, multipolar world, and we should not see Building Back Better or the European program or BRI as threats to each other. we should see them as interconnecting a global space where interconnection is a huge benefit. If we want a clean energy system, make a connected grid. Make it large so that the electrons can service a large area, especially with these intermittent energy sources. Transport doesn't make sense if the road stops at the border. We know that from different histories of rail being built on different gauges, and then you spend days shifting merchandise from one rail gauge to the next, and it's mind-boggling. I can understand where this thinking comes from, but truly, we need neighbors actually interconnected in a peaceful way. China and India, I know there are tensions, but truly, if these two great civilizations were working in harmony, that would be a wonderful thing for themselves and for the world. And I could name countless more cases where neighbors just need to get along.
No, I mean, just on that point, I think the world should know that India and China co-own the new development bank, and indeed are the two largest owners of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that's working in this space. Before I turn it back to the moderator, one quick question. Do you think in Glasgow and in Rome, the G20 and COP26, we are going to see an appetite to reprice capital so that commercial flows can complement development finance and large amount of green capital can help in the building up of countries that still have to reach their level of infrastructure development that is needed for prosperous living?
You know, private capital wants to go to developing countries, but it wants to go at 5% or 10% interest rates, which would kill these countries. So we need to have really a systematic understanding that when we call green bonds or SDG bond issuances, that they mean terms that are manageable for long-term development. I would say no country should be taking on debt that's more than, say, 200 basis points higher than the low-cost borrowers. Why punish the poor countries with crushing debt burdens in the future? And we are not there yet in the G20 understanding of this. We're not there yet in the capital market understanding, because capital markets want to make money, frankly. They're not into development per se. But we can change the nature of financing for much larger flows at much lower costs and really get this job done. That, to my mind, is the bottom line of what we need coming out of the G20 process this year and going into the G20 in Indonesia, and what we need for COP26. We need the financing to build the systems that are going to bring us the future that we want.
Well, Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you so much, Professor Sachs. Let me turn it back to our colleague.
Great thanks again, also from here, from Milan, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and also Samir Saran for this. And also looking ahead to the G20, you heard talking about infrastructure. Was the policy recommendation of the T20 on infrastructure? Let's have a look at this.
We have identified a fourfold agenda on infrastructure, which focus on data and technology, urbanization, social infrastructure, and smart cities, mobilizing capital and market for sustainable infrastructure and resilient infrastructure. Let me start with data and technology. We are convinced of the necessity to integrate digitalization and system modeling throughout the full life cycle of infrastructure to strengthen cross-border data management and improve data quality. We encourage promoting a more systemic convergence between social innovation and economic infrastructure investments, with a goal to reduce inequality and improve inclusion. The final point I wanted to make is about resiliency. Natural and man-made threats, extreme events, as well as prolonged disruptive hazard have a significant impact on infrastructure system. Building resilient infrastructure is an investment to increase asset life and significantly lower operation and management costs.
Well, we started with infrastructure, but you already heard talking about capital flows and trade. The task force on trade, investment, and growth has been chaired by Piercarlo Paduan, Professor Paduan, who's with us today here at Bocconi University. So please welcome Piercarlo Paduan, which I hope is here and can join me on the stage. Professor Paduan, welcome. And please take a seat, because for the opening remarks, we also have Pascal Lamy. As you know, Pascal Lamy has been the head of the World Trade Organization for 8 years. He's been European Commissioner for Trade. So it's an honor having him today. I would like to start asking Pascal Lamy, you spent basically your whole career fighting for free trade and against hard borders. But we know that the pandemic reignited the tension towards protectionism. So what do you think is left to the G20 to work in order to create more space and a future for free trade currently? Pascal Lamy.
Let me first thank, before answering your question, l'Istituto per gli Studi di Politica Internazionale and the Bocconi University as a co-host of this T20 Summit for this invitation. On this question, I think we have to make a difference, which is not often made between what I call protectionism on the one side, and on the other side, what I call precautionism. Protectionism is when you protect your producers from foreign competition. It's a well-known game. Precautionism is different. It's when you protect your people from risks. And this is a very different issue, although there may be some blurred frontier between protectionism on the one side and precautionism on the other side. What we've seen during the pandemic crisis is not protectionism, it's precautionism. Most of the trade measures that were taken during this crisis did not have as a purpose to protect producers from foreign competition, but to protect populations from this COVID virus, and to take the necessary consequences in order to properly address the sanitary shock and then the economic shock. So this is my own view, and I think the operational conclusion of this for the G20, hence, which I put on the table of the T20, is that we will need in the future a higher degree of regulatory convergence in this world. Regulatory convergence understood as the regulation of precaution, safety, security, pesticide in flowers, safety of lighters, safety of cars, safety of data, and this is a much more difficult ground. I think looking forward, including on the environmental side, we have to better organize the coexistence of trade opening on the one side and the exercise of precaution on the other side. This is what our populations are asking for.
Well, this is a great point, but Pascal Lamy, there's another aspect. We talk about the green and also the digital transition, and all of these will have an impact on international trade. How do you think we can promote a greener and more inclusive and sustainable international trade looking ahead?
On this question, I think you are right. We have collectively to face with two major challenges: the digital transition and the green transition. In both cases, and this is my contribution to this T20 discussion, looking at the G20 agenda, in both cases, I think we are running a serious risk of, if not deglobalization, I would not go that far, a serious risk of fragmentation of our systems. In the digital world, there is a risk of a bi or even tripolar world with US, China, and probably Europe. And this is pretty clear if you look, for instance, at the regulation of data privacy, data protection, data localization, data storage, data availability are regulated today in a different way in China, in US, and in Europe. And this entails a risk of fragmentation, which I think we should limit. We will not totally avoid this because of deep ideological differences that have a larger impact in the world of digitalization that they had in the previous world. Cars and bicycles are ideologically neutral, data are not. And this is something which I think deserves attention. And I would say the same about the risk of fragmentation, of globalization in decarbonization. We all have to cope with the same challenge, which is decarbonization of economies, and we all know that this entails time horizon of carbon net neutrality. I'm not worried by the fact that China is 2060 and Europe, US, Japan would be 2050. What matters is more coordination in our trajectories to get there, and more coordination in our trajectories to get there entails, in my view, more coordination in how we use the different available policy tools, whether it's taxation, whether it's emission trading, whether it's technical standards, whether it's incentives or subsidization. The toolbox is a well-identified one, but so far, again, if you look at US, China, Europe, we use them differently, which entails a risk of carbon leakages if carbon prices or tools to address this are so different. And I think, again, this is something that needs to be seriously considered for the future. We have, and this is what the three Instituts Jacques Delors in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels have proposed, a sort of comparability platform, which, in my view, should be around the WTO table.
Well, thank you so much, Pascal, Lamy, for this. And let me turn to Professor Paduan here on the stage in Milan. Professor Paduan, we just heard talking about fragmentation, and we know that in the last decade, especially when multilateralism was in a standstill position, there was a multitude of bilateral agreements and regional free trade agreements. So you've been working on this also in your task force here at the T20. What do you think that can ensure consistency between bilateral agreements and multilateral agreements looking ahead?
Thanks very much, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me anticipate that I share very much many of the issues raised by Sachs and by Pascal Lamy, with whom we had a very tight collaboration in this process. He mentioned in his final remarks the notion of risk, and this is something I would like to develop a little bit. First of all, how do we see the global economy after COVID? we see as a fragmented entity. And so if there is something fragmented, the key question becomes, will fragmentation go further down the road, or can we revert fragmentation? This is the key policy issue that at the global level, at the G20 level, should be addressed much more forcefully. Also because there are new risks down the line. If you look at the policy debate, the global policy debate these days, you list a long number of factors of risk, which I offer you only a small sample, but which are also telling of how much we should be aware of the fact that we need to have instruments to deal with risks. Well, the first risk that comes to mind is the new COVID risk. Is there the risk that we have a new COVID experience? Oh, well, heaven forbid, but this is a risk we must have in our agenda. Then we have risks which relate to the fact that the macroeconomics performance is at a turning point. There are now new talks of having a stagflationary situation going forward. More inflation, there's a lot of debate about that, but also less growth. And then, of course, there is the green transition, which bears risk. One way to characterize it is the following. The green transition might be going on too slowly, so we do not reach our targets. But paradoxically, it might be too fast, because it generates pressure in the society, which may not be sustainable. And this is a clear issue which relates to fragmentation at large. Transformations in the global system and its integration have to be dealing also with social sustainability. People must be the target of policies, and therefore if policies do not target people, they are doomed to fail. So how do we shape up our response to this situation? This is the last point that Pascal made. How do we transform a multipolar world into a newly integrated system? This is where the G20 come in as a very powerful potential instrument. What G20 have to avoid is, first of all, what we might be calling aggressive geopolitics, which you all know what it means, which is a global responsibility. It's not because some countries or regions are more geopolitical than others. It's the way they interact that it's not acceptable. So how do we avoid geopolitics? One answer is, let's go down the regional alley. This is not a new debate. In the international economy debate in the 1990s and 1980s, there was a lot of discussion asking the question, what do we do to replace the Bretton Woods system which collapsed? And the conclusion was, we need a new regional structure. However, regionalism may be open or closed, and if it's closed, it's conflictual. So the question, in my view, becomes, how do we use platforms such as the G20 to generate open multilateralism and regionalism? Well, let me conclude my first statement by saying that we know a little bit about how in the past these systems operated, to know that there are a few conditions which need to be taken into account to make regionalism sustainable. One is that regionalism changes over the medium to long term. Therefore, countries participating in regional agreement, including in the bipolar sense, must be ready to adapt preferences so that there is a meeting of the minds, that we just do not keep our preferences intact and expect others to do changes. We must all have a propensity to change, number one. Number two, this happens over the long term. And this has to be accompanied by institutional changes. In our work for the T20, we looked at some depth at how to reform the WTO. And the WTO is an institution which has been very important, now needs to be revamped, but this needs to be put in context of a long term. And final point, and I'll stop, is this has to do having people in mind. And people in mind also means how to involve markets into the story. I may sound a little bit different with what Jeff Sachs said about markets, but we need to find ways, and we know that it is possible in practice, on how to generate incentives so that markets help rather than go against multilateralism. Let me conclude with one example: the environment and financial markets. We need to have a mechanism that redirect financial resources to finance infrastructure, to finance healthcare, to finance green development. This is possible. What we need to do at a policymaker level is to design rules and implement rules in a way that reconcile social targets with individual incentives. This is possible, and there are many examples that show that this is the case. And in Europe, we are at the vanguard of this process. So I am very much confident this is the way to go forward.
Well, Professor Padoan, to go beyond fragmentation, it takes trust, it takes transparency, it takes a level playing field. So you've been working on that, and what are the main recommendations that you feel like to share from the T20 on this?
Well, the main recommendation is, first of all, that trade is important, but as Pascal said, it's not the only issue. So one area of recommendation is exploit the political platform of the G20 to look for what economists of international relations call issue linkage. We can achieve improvement in trade relations if we couple it with security relations, so that on the table there are more options to be exploited by countries around the table, number one. Number two, as I said before, the G20 by definition is a long-term instrument. Let me recall that the G20 as it stands today was established after the breakout of the great financial crisis. And since then, it has evolved in dictating the policy agenda. Sometimes it has worked, sometimes it has worked less. But there are cases in which there is success. So policy can be cooperative. We should reject the idea that there is only conflict among countries or among sovereigns over the long term. This is not so. It's difficult to find common agreements, collective goods, public goods, but it's possible. So this is the major recommendation which comes out of the G20, and the WTO reform should be put in that perspective.
Thank you for this, Professor Padoan. We'll get back to you in a moment, but now we have three outstanding panelists that I want to introduce to discuss this, and let me start with introducing them. They're all online. Pamela Koch-Hamilton, Executive Director at International Trade Center. Professor Kenneth Rogoff, you see them all on the screen, Professor of Economics at the Harvard University and former Chief Economist at the International Monetary Fund. Welcome also to James Zahn, who's Senior Director at the Division on Investment and Enterprises at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Welcome, all ladies and gentlemen. Let me start with Pamela Koch-Hamilton with a very, I tend to ask simple question, but how can trade, we heard about fragmentation, we heard about that the legacy of COVID-19 is an increased level of poverty and inequality. How can international trade help to face and tackle this issue?
Thanks so much, Andrea, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel with other distinguished speakers. I'd like to commend the Italian government for shining the spotlight on these three important pillars: people, planet, and prosperity. I think, like many of you, I'm concerned by the increasing levels of vulnerability caused by the pandemic. In my own country, Jamaica, over 50,000 persons working in tourism, an industry which employs mostly women, have lost their jobs. On the other side of the world, a third of women-owned enterprises surveyed in India closed their businesses temporarily or permanently. So we see it at a larger scale in the UN Secretary General's report on the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Global unemployment increased by 33 million, with young people and women being hit the hardest. If we let that sink in for a moment, it definitely raises our temperature. It's our duty, I think, as governments and partners to prevent any further losses. We need to act now to make trade more inclusive and support those most vulnerable to withstand the economic shocks. So we need to make critical policy choices and create a supportive ecosystem that can help weather the storm. Trade finance and financial assistance, whether through tax relief or delays in loan payments, is key in the recovery efforts. Secondly, investments in technology and innovation to help more MSMEs integrate into the digital economy need to be fast-tracked. Many MSMEs, especially those in LDCs, are being left behind due to the lack of ICT infrastructure and also access to indispensable technologies. Women entrepreneurs must be prioritized in all policies and ODA recovery efforts to enable them to become strong players in global trade. The G20 also has a tremendous role in working through the WTO and other multilateral organizations to cooperate for economic and social recovery. So addressing inequalities through trade also requires a commitment to keeping development at the center of trade. And our keynote address speaker, Pascal Lamy, in his previous slide, fought to revive the Doha Development Round discussions. Perhaps history has provided us with another opportune time to rethink how trade can foster greater equality while putting people and planet at the forefront. At the ITC, we're driven to create the trade impact for good, or inclusive trade. Over the past year, while the pandemic has threatened the livelihoods of so many, we have been pushing ahead to strengthen MSME's resilience. Today, it's the pandemic. Tomorrow, a new shock will emerge. It's the nature of the game. So through the support of many of our G20 partners and others, we have created opportunities for the most vulnerable to benefit from trade. Our She Trades program, for example, we invested in creating a tailored coaching pilot program in early 2020, which resulted in 94% of the women entrepreneurs reporting improved business operations. These women also now have an e-commerce strategy, improved ability to embed international payment solutions into their operations, and partnerships with logistics providers such as UPS to accelerate exports. Our She Trades Outlook, which was launched in 2020, we're helping policymakers with data analytics to flag areas for reform and assist them in designing deliberate interventions, such as in government procurement, to support women in trade. We're also supporting companies to build back better by focusing on green business practices and sustainability through our Green to Concrete hubs. So helping MSMEs in their green transition has begun to pay off. And I think that that's important. Thank you. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pamela Koch-Hamilton. Professor Kenneth Rogoff, when we look at the reopening of the economy in terms of also international trade flows, what we see is that supply couldn't match demand. And so we have disruption, we have bottlenecks, we have higher prices for commodities and not just commodities. Do you think that this is just temporary or is more structural and will be with us for a longer period, Professor?
Well, let me just start by thanking the Italian government for organizing this important G20 event. And I follow some excellent remarks by Professor Sachs, by Pier Carlo Padoan, and by Pamela Koch-Hamilton. And I particularly want to pick up on the last set of remarks, which leads into your question, which is this has been a very uneven pandemic. It's actually affected growth less than people expected if you look at the aggregate numbers, but it's been very uneven and hit very hard at the poor and lower income within countries, which has received a lot of attention, and across countries, which has received a lot less attention. We had a period it's the first part of the century where there's a lot of catch up, a lot of people being pulled out of poverty. And now we have this incredible regression. And so when we talk about supply chains and trade, this is also something that's not going to fall evenly. So let me just make a couple quick comments about your specific question. I think the lessons from the Great Recession and a lot of research that's been done on COVID-19 is that left to their own devices, the supply chains will reorganize. Yes, there are bottlenecks because this incredibly complex system starting up very unevenly. The demand for manufacturers is high. Services is very weak. We heard about tourism. And so the supply chain, the global network isn't built for these imbalances, but it will adjust if governments let it. And I think the big debate here is how much should governments push to have reshoring to provide, I guess what Pascal Lamy was describing as precaution as opposed to protectionism. I don't think, I think you read about companies looking at reshoring, but I think they're not doing that much of it. They're so dependent on China as the workshop to the world, on trade with commodities for other countries. But I think the real questions with governments, and I think what a lot of research says, again, to underscore what Pascal Lamy said, it's very tricky business, how much is precaution and when you slip into protectionism. And if we slip into protectionism, then certainly the effects can be long lasting. And let me finally lead into a comment about how long these will last, the effects you asked about commodity prices and inflation. You know, I worry that it can be longer than we think, that the geopolitical tensions, that various problems really governments are having, reorganizing, deciding what to do, are going to lead to a retreat from trade and from globalization, which has been a big factor keeping inflation low. We could see this run into reverse. So I think to say something Pierre Carlo Padoan said, Jeffrey Sachs put a big emphasis on how much money needs to flow, and that's true. But I think there has to be a role for markets here, that if governments get in the way, prevent global supply chains from working, we could see both slower growth and higher inflation, and yes, this specter of stagflation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rogov. Longer than we think. It's a bit concerning, especially given the central banks will have to manage this for a longer period maybe than expected. But let me move over to Jim Sun. In talking about foreign direct investment, that we know it's a crucial tool, especially for the development countries, to keep grow. But how about combining these FDI flows with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations? What are the key actions you're taking to align these two?
Thank you for having me. First, about the current trends and prospects, and then the sustainability financing and action plans. Regarding current trends, we see a kind of rapid recovery of global investment, but growing divergence. In a sense, we see a kind of a global FDI that declined by 35%, but this year we expect a kind of a recovery between 10 to 15%, and perhaps next year another 20% at getting back to the track of the level of 2019. But having said that, we see the kind of divergence in three areas. One is the developing country kind of dimension, that developed countries FDI is recovering very rapidly. We have seen the first quarter of this year, but for developing countries, it's lagging. The recovery of investment is very slow. Secondly, there's divergence between greenfield investment and cross-border merger acquisitions. And in fact, we see the recovery is more of properly restructuring driven, replenish of the inventories, instead of new capacity adding through new investment. That's what we call greenfield investment. And the third is that we see a kind of a manufacturing is heading while services, particularly in hospitality industries and others, are lagging. So that's kind of the divergence. What is worrisome is the first one, that is developing countries is lagging in the recovery of investment. And the medium term, we see a lot of risks. The kind of a risk, I would say, typically 3 Fs: fuel, food, and finance. These are the really sensitive areas that will be disruptive further to global value chain, to global economic recovery, and to investment flows. Longer term wise, I would say there's kind of fundamental transformation driven by 3 mega drivers. That is sustainability imperative, SDG, and corporate responsibilities. The second is new industrial revolution, and the third is kind of economic nationalism, or the realignment of global economic governance. All these will drive the global value chain to a direction of regionalization, reshoring, and additive manufacturing for smaller, going for scope rather than scale. But I wouldn't elaborate on that. But I would say at this stage, we see that the investment, or we see the economic stimulus packages as a very small proportion for long-term investment for recovery, but more for rescuing. And looking at the overall kind of stimulus packages getting into it, we would see roughly about $3.5 trillion is really used for, designated for long-term financing for recovery and sustainable development, while there's a potential of crowding in $10 trillion. But compare with the overall package is just roughly about 10%. That is one factor. But the important factor, we see the impact of pandemic on SDGs, investing in SDGs. We have this 15 sectors we classified as investment intensive for achieving SDGs. And for that, the drastic decline of investment, domestic, foreign, public and private, is roughly between 1/3 to 2/3 of decline. And in fact, it's basically undone the progress made over the past 6 years, that since 2015. That is very worrisome. But paradoxically, we have seen the kind of rapid growth of financing for sustainable development. And this sustainability financing, I'm talking about upstream, increased by 80% last year. It reached $3.2 trillion. That includes $1.7 trillion of private equity that designated to sustainability purposes, $1.7 trillion of green funds, green bonds, and then there will be kind of 200 billion of US dollars of social bonds, and that is 200 billion of mixed bonds. Altogether, it's a 3.2 trillion US dollars funds designated for sustainability. But having said that, overwhelming majority of such funds were basically domiciled in the north. It's over 90% or even 95%. So in fact, the sustainability designated funds are not crossing the equator to the south. And it doesn't generate any impact on that. And also, if we see this decline, we see that all these financing in terms of funds are not translating into pipeline bankable projects into the SDG sectors, particularly to developing countries for poverty alleviation.
Yeah. Thank you, James, for this. I have to jump to the conclusion because unfortunately we have rigid time constraints. In a few minutes, we'll leave the floor to the IMF Managing Director. So let me get back to Pamela Coke-Hamilton asking about SMEs, because SMEs are the backbone of all the economies. And I know you've been working hard also on taking them global, with different actions. I have to ask everyone kindly to remain under 2 minutes, because otherwise it's a big problem for me at least. Thanks.
We will do that. All right, let me state up front that it's not solely about financing. And for those of us who are parents, we know that raising kids is more than about money. It's also about an ecosystem. So we think, first of all, there needs to be support to an ecosystem that supports MSMEs in a myriad of ways. First, we need to start with access to market intelligence. And it's very important for MSMEs to have this access, also to know about tariff changes, export restrictions, mandatory licensing requirements. And if there's ever a time they need real data, it's now. The other thing is connection to international value chains. I think James spoke about this before, but they face incredible barriers in terms of market requirements. Thirdly, the ecosystem has to look at vibrant in-country trade support institutions, and we work with them to try to develop their capacity to actually help their MSMEs. The regulatory environment is also critical, and we need to see how the regulatory environment within countries can operate. One quick statistic is, the limited access to finance remains a primary obstacle for growth. And according to the IFC, 40% of formal MSMEs in developing countries have an unmet need of $5.2 trillion. every year, which is significant. So what we're saying is that there needs to be a whole of system approach: financing, market intelligence, developing e-commerce, digitizing, and enabling them to access markets across the board. So I'll just stop there because I know time is of the essence.
Thank you so much. Professor Rogov, you heard talking about FDI, and during the pandemic, they reduced by 40% or something like that. Now, this situation is complicated, and what do you make of the potential of global cooperation to restart an FDI flows towards especially poorest country?
Well, first and foremost, I think there needs to be much more equitable vaccine distribution. You're not going to see the FDI flow quickly until that problem is solved. And that's something there's clearly a role for global cooperation, as I think there is in many other areas. If I would single out one, it would be the energy transition is something where the advanced economies have a big incentive to try to support, to provide financial support to the emerging world, to developing economies, to have green energy. I will just mention I proposed forming a world carbon bank to try to give the technical expertise and the channel for this funding. I don't think the existing international financial institutions, much as I hope they recover from their recent problems, are really well suited to this. So this is something beyond this. I think, just to be short, I think we've really had excellent remarks from James Zahn about what the numbers are here, and from my other co-panelist, Pamela Hamilton, about what the focus should be. And I can only say I agree with them.
Thank you so much, Professor Rogov. James Zahn, lastly, do you think that the situation in terms of FDI flows can get better in this current condition of the economy, or worse? And in a few words, what do you think is looking ahead?
Yeah, looking ahead, as I mentioned earlier, the prospects look for the short term. I'm talking about this year and next, that there will be continual recovery. Recovery is slower than trade and the GDP, and it's typically 6 months to 12 months of lagging. But what is more worrisome is the kind of divergence between developing countries. And here, I wish to use my limited 1.5 minutes focusing on the action plans that I think Pamela has already mentioned some of them. But I would say there's 6 sets of transformative actions we need for promoting investment in sustainable development goals. And first is mainstreaming the SDGs into national investment policy framework and international investment treaty regimes. We have done a survey that over 60% of the countries surveyed, that's over 120 countries, and basically they haven't have set investment strategies in SDGs into their national development strategies, nor have they factored in SDGs into their national investment policy framework. And for the international investment treaty regimes, we say that over 90% of these 3,400 investment treaties predates the SDG launching date. Therefore, there's not, most of treaties do not even mention sustainable development. Therefore, mainstreaming SDG is important. Second, reorienting the investment promotion facilitation schemes that includes reform the kind of incentive schemes and try to move it towards SDGs, also bearing in mind the global tax reforms that will have a bearing on the investment promotion, including SDGs. The third is to establish SDG investment compact. Now, we need for small economies to work together to build a larger market, industrial clustering, infrastructure connectivities, a kind of a way for this investment compacts, and then fostering the new partnership between multinationals, impact investment, and the small developing countries. And then there's also an importance for pipeline bankable projects, and we are building the capacity for countries by some projects and by some guidelines and toolkits.
Well,
I think my time is up.
I'm afraid it is. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your remarks. It was really a pleasure having you discussing here at the T20 today. And for your final takeaway, Professor Padoan, given what you heard from the panelists.
My final takeaway is that we need all to cooperate. We can address specific points such as infrastructure, such as value chains, such as finance, but these must be made consistent to some form of governance. And again, the G20 is the platform to do that.
Thanks again, Piercarlo Padoan, who's been chairing the T20 task force on this. Thank you, because our time is unfortunately over, because there's a very important moment, and I invite and the President Mario Monti and Senator Mario Monti and Paolo Magri to join me on the stage for introducing, please, the IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva speech today here, not just at the T20, but also anticipating what's going to happen with the meetings. Please. Now I think it's the time for introducing the speech of Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund.
Buongiorno a tutti voi. Thank you for the warm welcome, and many, many thanks to Bocconi University and the global think tank community for inviting me to this important G20 event. And I'm delighted to join Mario and Paolo for our discussion today. I am sure that the students at Bocconi University, like young people everywhere, are excited about their return to in-person learning and come to it with renewed sense of energy and optimism. And that brings me to the good news on the global economy. Over the past 10 months, vaccines have helped save millions of lives. And together with extraordinary policy support, this has allowed us to push forward, moving from crisis towards recovery. But that is only part of the story. We face a global recovery that remains hobbled by the pandemic and its impact. We are unable to walk forward properly. It is like walking with stones in our shoes. The most immediate obstacle is the great vaccination divide. Too many countries with too little access to vaccines, leaving too many people unprotected from COVID. At the same time, countries remain deeply divided in their ability to respond, in being able to support the recovery, and their ability to invest for the future. But we cannot secure a stronger recovery everywhere and shape a better post-pandemic world for all unless we work together to overcome these divides. And this will be the focus of our annual meetings next week. Let's look at the economic picture. In July, we projected global growth at 6% in 2021. As you will see in our updated World Economic Outlook next week, we now expect growth to moderate slightly this year. But the risks and obstacles to a balanced global recovery have become even more pronounced. The stones in our shoes have become more painful. I will focus on three of them. The first is the divergence in economic growth. The United States and China remain vital engines of growth, even as their momentum is now slowing. A few advanced and emerging economies are still gaining momentum, including Italy and Europe more broadly. By contrast, in many other countries, growth continues to worsen, hampered by low access to vaccines and constrained policy response, especially in some low-income nations. And this divergence in economic fortunes is becoming more persistent. Economic output in advanced economies is projected to return to pre-pandemic trends by 2022, by next year. But most emerging and developing countries will take many more years to recover. This delayed recovery will make it even more difficult to avoid long-term economic scarring, including from job losses, which hit young people, women, informal workers, especially hard. The second stone in our shoe is inflation. Headline inflation rates have increased rapidly in a number of countries, but again, with some more affected than others. While we do expect price pressures to subside in most countries in 2022, in some emerging and developing economies, price pressures are expected to persist. One particular concern with inflation is the rise in global food prices, up by more than 30% over the past year. Together with rises in energy prices, this is putting further pressure on poorer families. More generally, inflation prospects remain highly uncertain. A more sustained increase in inflation expectations could cause a rapid rise in interest rates and a sharp tightening of financial conditions. This would pose a particular challenge for emerging and developing economies with high debt levels. And that brings me to the third stone, debt. We estimate that global public debt has increased to almost 100% of GDP. Much of this reflects the necessary fiscal response to the crisis, as well as the heavy output and revenue losses due to the pandemic. And here we see yet another deep divide, with some countries more affected than others, especially in the developing world. Many started the pandemic with very little fiscal firepower. Now, they have even less room in their budgets and very limited ability to issue new debt at favorable terms. In short, they face tough times and are caught on the wrong side of the fiscal financing divide. So how do we go about removing these stones from our shoes and overcoming these divisions and obstacles to recovery? So here is our answer. Vaccinate, calibrate, accelerate. First, vaccinate the world. We can still reach the targets put forward by the IMF with the World Bank, WHO, and WTO to vaccinate at least 40% of people in every country by the end of this year and at least 70% by the first half of 2022. But we need a bigger push. We must sharply increase delivery of doses to the developing world. Richer nations must deliver on their donation pledges immediately. And together, we must boost vaccine production and distribution capabilities, remove trade restrictions on medical materials. In addition to vaccines, we must also close a $20 billion gap in grant financing for testing, tracing, therapeutics. If we don't, large parts of the world will remain unvaccinated, and the human tragedy will continue. That would hold the recovery back. We would see global GDP losses rise to $5.3 trillion over the next 5 years. Let's go to the second piece of our answer. Calibrate policies to country circumstances. The longer the pandemic is with us, the more persistent the divisions between countries will be, and the more difficult and varied the policy choices become. Take inflation and monetary policy. Our view is that central banks can generally look through current inflation pressures and avoid tightening now. But countries that are already facing rising inflation expectations and more persistent price pressures have had to tighten, a difficult choice amid a stop-start recovery. And we must not forget to monitor financial risks, including stretched asset variations, which vary widely across countries. Calibrating policies also means carefully tailoring fiscal measures. The longer the pandemic persists, the tighter the fiscal constraints will become, forcing difficult trade-offs between lifelines to people, near-term support to the economy, and advancing long-term structural goals. Low-income countries face particular challenges with massive financing needs, high debt burden, and most recently, sharply higher debt servicing costs. They will need more revenue mobilization, more concessional financing, and more help to deal with the debt problems. To face these challenges, what works best is policy credibility. When governments project sound medium-term frameworks to ensure the right balance between providing support now and reducing debt over time, then there is trust from citizens and from markets. As countries grapple with the need to vaccinate their populations and calibrate policies, they must also look at the future, one that is greener, that is smarter, that is fairer. This brings me to the third policy imperative: accelerate the reforms needed to transform economies. Amid the sweeping global changes in the years and decades ahead, we see three priority issues for economic and financial stability: climate change, technological change, inclusion. We know that fighting climate change is critical for the planet and for prosperity. The dire warnings of the recent IPCC report on climate change leave us in no doubt that we must act, and we must act now. We need a robust price on carbon. We need substantial scaling up of green investment over the next 2 decades. And we need support for the most vulnerable within societies and among countries. This will help ensure a transition that benefits all, and one that is just. The green transition also presents huge opportunities: the shift to renewables, new electricity networks, energy efficiency, low carbon mobility. And to do this with a combination of supply policies, we can raise global GDP by about 2% this decade and create 30 million new jobs. And of course, private sector finance will be key, which requires stronger global efforts to improve data, disclosures, and taxonomies. The digital revolution also presents enormous opportunities. Scaling up digital infrastructure investment is key, combined with investment in people's education, in skills, in health, in basic research. This is how we can make economies more productive and more inclusive. To unlock this potential, we need fairer and more efficient tax systems. Completing the agreement on global minimum corporate tax is vital to help mobilize revenue for transformative investments. By working together, we can ensure that the transformation of the international monetary system benefits all. Just one example shows that digital currencies issued by central banks can reduce the time needed for cross-border payments to seconds and sharply cut costs. Clearly, the possibilities, but also the perils of new technology will need to be carefully managed. Given the enormity of the policy challenges to overcome these obstacles, we need decisive action at all levels, national and multilateral. For our part, we at the IMF remain a steadfast partner of our member countries. We are continuing to calibrate our financial support as well as our policy analysis and technical advice. And we will accelerate our own transformation to meet our members' evolving needs. We have stepped up in an unprecedented manner by providing 118 billion in new financing to 87 countries, and debt service relief to our poorest members. Thanks to the collective will of our membership, we provided a new allocation of special drawing rights of $650 billion in August. This is the largest issuance in the IMF's history in this crisis like no other. About $275 billion of the allocation went to emerging and developing countries where the needs are gravest. Countries have benefited immediately from holding the new SDRs as part of their official reserves, which can boost confidence and lower borrowing costs. And some already are using part of their SDRs for priority needs or planning to do so. Nepal for vaccine imports, North Macedonia for health spending and pandemic lifelines, Senegal to boost vaccine production capacity, and for Haiti, already facing a very difficult situation, the SDRs will help finance vital imports. Yet, there is more we can do to help countries remove the obstacles to recover. We can magnify the impact of the allocation, and we can ensure that more SDRs go to countries most in need. We are calling on countries with strong external positions to voluntarily channel their SDRs. This means getting SDRs into our poverty reduction and growth trust, increasing our ability to provide zero-interest loans to low-income countries. We are also engaging with our members on using SDRs to create a new resilience and sustainability trust to help low-income and vulnerable middle-income countries to achieve a sustainable and prosperous future. Making the most of these SDRs is good for the global recovery, good for countries, good for people. That brings me to my final thoughts. I often worry about the world my granddaughter, this little girl I so dearly love, will inherit. But our setting today gives me hope. It is a source of inspiration. Despite an ocean between us, we have come together to envisage a better future. The students gathered here, the fine students of Bocconi University, have the energy, have the enthusiasm, and the wisdom of learning needed to overcome the obstacles that lay before us. We have learned so much from the past 18 months. This extraordinary crisis has divided us, but it has also armed us with knowledge that allows us to think differently about our future. It is very fitting we are discussing this at Bocconi, where economic and social progress are values steeped deep in the history of the university. Now we should use this clarity of thought and the lessons from the crisis to remove the obstacles in our way, remove the stones from our shoes, and walk forward to a better future for all. Molte grazie.
Thank you so much, dear Kristalina. We are very, very proud to have your inspiring presence today at Bocconi with our friends from ISPI. And I believe that your message, well, to the whole world, but in particular to Bocconi students today, will remain as a beacon as they move towards a difficult but very promising future. You have a unique perspective on global governance. Very few people, maybe none, have the same perspective. You have held with great honor leadership positions at the European Union, at the World Bank, now at the IMF. So can I ask you to reflect with us on whether you see any changes, any marginal changes maybe, to the structure of global governance and institutions needed in order to give more energy to the fight against pandemics and to prepare our health systems better in case of global health threats?
Thank you very much, Mario. My most sincere thanks to Bocconi University and to ISPI. And I'm so honored that Paolo is also with us for bringing me to this remarkable T20 series of events. I am so impressed by your program. Anybody I would have liked to hear from, you have it on the program. So congratulations, bravo. Let me get to your question. What we are faced with is a very rapidly changing world that is more prosperous, but it is also at higher risk of more frequent and more severe shocks. We have seen it with the pandemic. This year, we have seen it quite profoundly with climate shocks. And that makes it so very important that we think about building resilience to these shocks by having a more integrated and collaborative system of governance in countries and, of course, at the global level. Let me start with an analogy of what has been done in terms of addressing the risks of climate change. For quite some time, that was a priority topic for environmental ministries, for climate activists, but it was not so much integrated, mainstream in economic policies. It wasn't top of mind for ministries of finance or for central bankers. That has changed. And we now see the impact of this change in terms of integration of climate policies. For example, at the IMF, our board recently approved bringing climate mitigation for large emitters, adaptation for countries at high risk into our Article 4 consultations. This is our annual assessment of where national economies are and where the global economy, as a result of this assessment, we can project to be. That is the right way to go. We also integrate climate in our financial sector assessment programs, the famous FSAPs. Why? Because we want to understand risks to financial stability stemming from climate shocks, but also from the transition to the low carbon economy. We have seen ministers of finance coming together in a coalition on this topic. We also have experienced a horrible health shock. The pandemic actually is not something that was not expected. For a long time, people were saying, in this highly integrated world, if there would be a transmissible disease that could go around the world, that could be a major risk, of course, to the well-being of people, but also to the world economy. And this risk materialized. What we now recognize is that, of course, our number one priority today is to fight the pandemic, so vaccinate, make sure we protect people, and we protect the world economy, the recovery of the world economy. But we also have to reflect, how can we be in a better position to anticipate pandemics in the future, to be better prepared for them, and to be globally mobilized. I saw you talking about the Global Health and Finance Board. This is going in the right direction, because what it says is we have to work across the health and finance community, actually integrate the health and finance community, so we can have measures in place to be much better prepared for the future. And of course, as always, when you are to go forward to create a new institution, if the global community decides to do that, which I think has a strong rationale, we have to reflect on what we have already, how we can make sure that there is no duplication, or we are not doing something that may not productively surface in the future, how we make sure that WHO, an organization that the world needs and needs it to be even stronger, can guarantee we have surveillance in place, and that fits into economic policy through this global board. To finish on this point, we are in a period of transformation, and rightly so. We cannot sit passive in this world of rapid change, and we have to accept that building resilience to shocks would require this institutional integration and collaboration in a way that is much more dynamic and agile for the future.
Thank you, Kristalina. I'm sure your words were very well received by the Italian presidency of the G20, which is working exactly in this direction of a global health and finance board, with all the caveats of how to fit that into the system that you rightly reminded us of.
Thank you, Mario. Managing Director, your words were also very well received by the think tank community. We have approximately 9,000 think tanks and experts connected to listen to the T20 and to your keynote. And let me thank you also on behalf of the entire think tank community, which ISPI and IAI are coordinating this year in the framework of the T20. You mentioned several potential threats to financial stability. Do you see digital and cryptocurrencies as one? And if so, what should be done to manage them?
Thank you, Paolo, for the question, and of course, thank you for being with you today. We, from the IMF perspective, are indeed concentrated on macroeconomic and financial stability. Whether we talk about climate shocks or pandemic or the digital developments, it is from that perspective how that would impact macroeconomic and financial stability. When we look at the world of digitalization, digital currencies, of course, are a very important part of it. Before the pandemic, remember, we used to say the future is digital. With the pandemic, the future has arrived, and very prominently in the world of money. So let me first talk about the opportunities that this presents. We are now in a position to fairly quickly accelerate transfers of money to make it seamless and less costly. But to do so, we need to be clear about what do we mean by digital money first. When we look at this universe, the most reliable are central bank digital currencies. Why? Because they have the backing of the state, and they are integrated in the monetary policy thinking of a state. Central bank digital currencies are still a novelty. In fact, there is only one in existence at this point. The Bahamas issued their cent dollar, the first country to have central bank digital currency, but they're going to be quite prominent. We did a survey of our membership, and it was very impressive. 110 countries are at some stage of looking into CBDCs, into central bank digital currencies. So that is going to be moving quite rapidly. And of course, that presents on its own a very important question: how do we guarantee interoperability of central bank digital currencies? How we make sure that we coordinate globally the impact that they may have on monetary policy. The second component of digital money are stable coins and e-money. They're privately issued, but they are convertible to national currency one-to-one. M-Pesa in Kenya or USD in the United States. They have backing in assets, they're liquid, and in that sense, they do fill the digital gap in privately issued money. And then comes the third category of money that is actually called money, but is de facto assets, like bitcoins. They are a privately issued, but not backed by assets, means of holding value. And this value is more volatile. It may go up, up, up. It may drop down. And in that sense, in the history of money, it is difficult to think of them as money. So my biggest point up to now is we have to differentiate and not amalgamate all these three into one if we are to understand the risks. When we think about the critical issues to consider, number one is trust. Is the public believing in digital, in CBDC, in stable coins? Is the private sector believing that this is a means of exchange that they can trust? And of course, legal frameworks are critical, institutional frameworks are critical for this trust. The second issue is domestic stability. Is this going to help to have more stable economic transactions? Can we have carefully designed public-private partnerships that provide for the economy rather than put it on more on rocks? And the last one is where the IMF and other institutions like BIS come, international stability. We have to have regulation, we have to get rules in place if we want, in the world of money, digital to be a plus rather than a risk. And it is very impressive how much the international community, the central banks, institutions like ours, are now actively engaged to make sure that in this fast-moving world of digitalization, money is a source of confidence and helps the economy function rather than a risk.
Thank you. Mario?
Now, if I may, a quick but maybe somewhat sensitive question, Kristalina. Mm-hmm. Under your leadership, the IMF cares and studies inequalities much more than before. And I salute this. I believe that all the organizations and national governments should. Now, there is a view, as you know, that a prolonged period of highly accommodating monetary policies pursued by the largest central banks in the world for some years now may contribute to inequalities in income and assets. What's your view on this?
Well, let me first be very, very clear that what has been done over the last 18 months by central banks helped prevent a potential collapse of the world economy. When the pandemic hit, central banks stepped forward very rapidly to make sure that when the economy is on standstill, we can retain support for households, support for businesses, and that has been crucial. What it also has done is to keep interest rates low, and in fact, what we see is that going up, but that service in many places has been going down. Now, that, of course, may change as we move forward in a world where inflation expectations may risk to de-anchor, and in that case, central banks will have to normalize policies. Now, when we have that loose monetary policy, obviously that makes it attractive to move into assets. And who goes into assets? People who have better means. If you are hand to mouth, it is unlikely that this would happen to you. But even for people that are hand to mouth, people who are the poorest parts of society, having credit at a low cost means that there is support for growth and support for jobs. So to sum it up, our analysis says the impact of monetary policy on inequality is muted. There are factors that make the wealthier benefit, but there are also factors that make poor people benefit from more accommodative monetary policy. This being said, we recognize we have to do more research in this area. And most importantly, we need to recognize we walk on two legs. We have monetary policy and we have fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can be very effective in addressing inequality and, if you wish, compensating to the extent that monetary policy may be more serving the richer part of society. And we have seen in many countries that recognition that fiscal and monetary policy do need to go hand in hand to protect the social fabric, to protect our societies for becoming more unequal. Unfortunately, this is, in this pandemic, a risk that we absolutely have to take to heart. And I hope we can work with you on this big question, how we can make sure that policies, monetary and fiscal policies, work for the health and vibrancy of our societies, work against inequality.
Thank you very much, Paolo.
Thank you. Managing Director, to avoid economic collapse during the pandemic, your recipe, not only yours, was spend, 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 and keep the receipt. We spent, someone kept the receipt, but the result you mentioned in your presentation is that debt has skyrocketed, and also in Europe. Do you see Europe more fit for the future to avoid a new sovereign debt crisis?
Yes, I do. What we see in Europe is a very clear recognition that two things need to happen. One, emphasis on growth. And the new generation EU is a fantastic example, not only in supporting the recovery, injecting a growth momentum, but doing it in a way that transforms economies to be greener, digital, more inclusive. And that emphasis on growth is also integrated, embedded in domestic policies. And secondly, a very strong attention on medium-term fiscal consolidation. We are already seeing countries recognizing that the bills are going to come due, and that it is important that we gradually project confidence in that stabilization. And fiscal consolidation need not mean that we are going to have brutal cuts in education and healthcare. It means that we project over the next couple of years how we are going to gradually shift course so the debt burden is to be eased over time. That combination of growth and medium-term fiscal consolidation, I'm confident will bring Europe on a sound footing, and ministers of finance in Europe, policymakers in Europe seem to be quite engaged on those two sides.
Thank you, Mario.
Well, now I have the pleasure of asking Ludovica Arconte, a Bocconi student, to stand up and ask her questions to the Managing Director of the IMF.
Thank you, President Monti, and good afternoon, Managing Director. I'm Ludovica Arconte, a Bocconi International Management student. And firstly, I would really like to thank you for your time and the inspiring speech. Focusing on the topic of climate change, an issue that we truly study in all its aspects, and especially how it impacts the economic, social, and political world of today, I would like to ask you some questions. Over the last year and a half, the pandemic has been the focus of our interest in all the sectors, attracting most of our attention, and sometimes we can also say maybe distracting us from everything else. Thus, from a technical point of view, I wonder if the plans adopted to fight the pandemic at an international level, so both in terms of fiscal and monetary policies, have had or will have in the near future an impact on the actions planned to tackle climate change. Furthermore, I will add a second question from a more personal point of view, and I will take this possibility to ask you for an advice. And especially, what would you suggest and recommend to people my age, so students and young graduates, to do to have a really impact and a role in this global fight against climate change and its consequences? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ludovica. Great questions. To your first question, when the pandemic hit, many, myself included, were worried that the climate crisis may fall off the cliff of our attention. That didn't happen. On the contrary, what we see is a stronger recognition that climate shocks like the pandemic can be hugely destructive and undermine our future. What is so critical is to recognize that the fight against climate change is also an opportunity for a tremendous transformation in the way we work, we live, we communicate, we move around, an opportunity not to be missed. At the IMF, we came up with a construct of what absolutely must be done. One, we have to create the incentive for shifting to low carbon. And as economists, what is the incentive? Price carbon. We must gradually go up globally with the price on carbon. We believe that from the $3 a ton it is today, it has to be $75 a ton by 2030. Some say even higher. Move in that direction so we insensitize low carbon production, low carbon lifestyle. Two, invest from the public sector in the ingredients that help this transition and generate massively employment as a result. And three, and the third piece is so critical, we must make sure that there is a fairness in that if you are a miner, coal miner, that society cares about you, that there is a transition path for you. In other words, that if we generate revenues from carbon, we have to spend some of this money to make sure that those affected by the transition are supported. And I very strongly believe that we are at a cusp of a massive opportunity becoming a reality as we unite. You know that COP26 is knocking on the door. Italy plays a very important role. And that takes me straight to your second question. What can you do? Speak up, engage, and think about the importance that this moment in history has for all of us. one thing that I am keen to see young people doing more of is to say, hey, we care about the world of tomorrow, but we also care about the people today, and be part of this just transition with your hearts, with your minds, with your skills. And I am listening to you, I think that you personally can do a lot of it. Be out there.
Thank you very much. Managing Director, I mentioned the 1,000 think tanks which are following you. 3 of them have a question for you. And let me start with Bambang Brojonegoro, which will be the co-chair of the incoming Indonesian T20.
Honorable Chair and distinguished panelists, first of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to ISPI and Bocconi University as the co-host of the T20 Italy presidency this year. In this opportunity, I would like to ask a question to Ms. Kristalina Georgieva as the Managing Director of the IMF. My question is, how and to what extent international cooperation or efforts can help find and channel the trillions of dollars needed by emerging economies to close their digital and green gap? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bambang, and good luck. We have a second question, Kristalina.
Honorable Chair and distinguished.
We have a second question from Rose Ngugi, Executive Director of the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis.
My name is Rose Ngugi, Executive Director, KIPRA. I want to thank the Italian Institute for International Political Studies and Bocconi University for this opportunity, and Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director, IMF, for agreeing to take my question. With COVID-19, significant efforts have been made to relieve debt burden for less developed countries, including through a debt service suspension initiative, zero interest rates on IMF lending facilities, and debt treatment under the common framework. My question is, how do we further strengthen the efforts for debt restructuring for less developed countries, particularly in Africa, and what remains to be done to better engage the private sector?
Thank you. And let's now move to the third question from Carlos Ivan Simonsen Leal, who is president of Getulio Vargas Foundation, since many years an historical partner of Bocconi University and also as a think tank also of ISPI. Carlos.
Good afternoon to all. I would like to thank ISPI and Bocconi University for the opportunity to put a question to Mrs. Georgieva here today. Mrs. Georgieva, my question is the following. The most important central banks in the world are preoccupied with a possible rise of inflation, and therefore they will react to it. It is possible that this action will trigger a very nefarious effect on emerging markets. And that may backfire to the rest of the world. I would please ask you to tell us what are your thoughts about that and how we may hope for some coordination among central banks so that the effects will be minimal. Thank you.
Great questions. We have limited time, so I would shoot straight to the first one. Thank you for asking about the international cooperation to mobilize the substantial financing needed for this transformation to green and digital future. What is required at international level is, one, fulfill commitments made. There is a 100 billion a year commitment to help developing countries cope with the climate crisis. We ought to see that commitment fulfilled. Two, work with countries so they are more attractive for private capital. The countries themselves have a responsibility, rule of law, transparency, a good investment climate. But we as international community also have responsibility. International financial institutions collectively can be very supportive for that attractiveness. And we need to, third part of the answer is we need to innovate. We have to come up with instruments that are removing obstacles for this massive mobilization of financial means in the developing world. Take, for example, first loss guarantee. If we were to imagine a world in which there is a standardized first loss guarantee facility that when the investor sees it in the country, knows exactly what it is, it may help us move. We also have seen huge mobilization of innovation in terms of green finance and massive increase in that area. The more we can do to standardize reporting and make it believable, trustworthy, the more we would see the financial flows going where they're most needed, and we will play our role in that. On the question of debt, we have seen a very important breakthrough with the G20 common framework that brings all lenders, including private sector, to provide support for debt resolution in highly indebted countries. We have 3 countries that ask for treatment: Chad, Ethiopia, Zambia. Very important that we succeed, that the creditors and the debtors are able to move forward, so more countries are to step into that. But beyond that, I would mark 3 requirements for success, especially for private sector participation. First, debt transparency. We cannot be in a situation when we only see the tip of the iceberg, we don't know what is underneath. And the IMF is very engaged to help with that transparency. Second, sound debt management. And again, we provide a lot of support to countries to do that. And third, advancing the regulatory environment so private sector participation is more effective. For example, for climate events, why not have a standardized clause that allows a country to have a breathing space as the shock hits? Moving in that direction on debt is hugely important, as we know that the debt burden is going up, and we at the IMF are concentrated on debt sustainability analysis and engaging with all players so we do not allow debt build-up to turn into a crisis. And finally, I am extremely keen to see central banks continuing on the path they have adopted in this crisis: coordination. It has been impressive. It has to stay that way. Major central banks have a responsibility for clear forward communication of their intents. As for emerging markets and developing economies, now is the time to scrutinize your debt and see, can you do more in advance to what, as the question rightly pointed out, may be a forthcoming tightening of financial conditions. And again, we are here, we are doing our part, we are supporting our members to have prudent debt management approach in this time and minimize this risk. I know that we are to wrap it up. So back to you, Mario and Paolo.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kristalina, for being with us today. and for having shown us with great simplicity what leadership is, from analysis to policy clarity, to charisma and to inspiration. And we wish you all the best for your current and future work at the helm of the IMF. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Siamo qua. No, no, Mario. Stiamo. Sentiamo Cristoforetti. Last minute agreement. We agreed with the President Monti that we will both...
I was trying to leave Bocconi University to Paolo, but he doesn't want.
I would never dare in front of the rector, by the way. No, we have the pleasure together to now move to our next keynote speaker, Samantha Cristoforetti. She's already online, I guess. We know that you are very soon getting into a training preparation this morning for your next mission. So we are very happy, Professor Monti and myself, to have you with us.
Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the global audience. I'm very happy to greet Professor Monti, Vice President Paolo Magri, and the entire distinguished T20 audience. And I'm very honored to take part in this summit today. So I would like to thank both ISPI and Bocconi University for allowing me also on behalf of the European Space Agency to address such a distinguished audience of global thought leaders. A few years ago, I had the opportunity of spending several months on the International Space Station. And in that time, I could observe our planet and connect with our planet from what we like to call the orbital perspective. And it's that perspective that I would like to share with you today, the perspective of space and of what space can do for people, planet, and prosperity. So let's talk about space. Lots of people out there are talking about space today, and they often talk about a new space race. And there's talk about moon and Mars landers and nanosatellites and mega rockets and new commercial actors and space tourists. But if we scratch beneath this glossy surface, something even more exciting emerges. This is not a race. This is a revolution. Space, the next frontier of human progress, is becoming mainstream. It's becoming more and more part of our daily lives. It's as widespread as electricity, as the phones in our pocket, as our internet signal. It's getting closer to each and every one of us. So what does that mean for our future? What does that mean about people, planet, prosperity? What can space deliver? There's fantastic opportunities and also some unique challenges. Let's start with prosperity. The global space economy is currently 55% larger than just a decade ago. And the trend of the last 5 years shows uninterrupted growth. The space economy not only has weathered the global pandemic, but has actually emerged stronger. If you add to this the trickle-down effects into the non-space sectors, the innovative push of space technologies, the commercial spur of space applications, and the importance of space becomes even more relevant and clear. But as we know, prosperity is not only about wealth. It's about sustainable growth with purpose. The global pandemic has not only been a time of searching for economic solutions, but it has also been a time of soul searching. People have reflected upon their personal life choices. Collectively, as societies, we have reflected upon our values, our priorities, our way of life. And as we come out of this, we have this opportunity of building back better, greener, in a more sustainable way, in order to ensure not only the short-term recovery, but also our long-term sustainable prosperity. Space can and must have a role to play. Space applications can power smart cars and smarter cities, clean transportation, cleaner energy production. Navigation satellites provide global real-time data to optimize our supply chains or to drive our autonomous vehicles. Earth observation can be fed, the data from our Earth observation satellites can be fed into urban planning, whether it's about planning new infrastructure or protecting our cultural heritage or finding new sites for renewable energy production. Space can make agriculture more productive in spite of increasing heat and drought, and government response more resilient in the face of extreme weather and catastrophes such as floods or fires. Most importantly, space can help make our economic growth sustainable as we work towards the goal of a carbon-free economy by 2050. We can take care of prosperity and planet together for the people. So let's talk about planet, and allow me to bring you back 3 decades to 1989. I was a child back then, and the Montreal Protocol came into effect. And it was drawn up to address the alarming thinning of the ozone layer in the stratosphere. Some might remember that it was the very first agreement in the history of the United Nations that was ratified by all members. And few might even remember that it was an animation, a graphic animation based on satellite data that really drove the point home for people around the world and created that sense of urgency that made that effective response possible. Back then, it was the roof of our planet, of our house, that was leaking. Soon, our entire house will be on fire. Or as the IPCC report put it in a very short but effective manner, it's warming. It's us. Yes, we are sure. It is bad, but we can fix it. We have no choice but to fix it, and space can help. Here's a hard fact. More than half of the essential climate variables that feed our very complex climate models can only be measured from space. And we cannot manage what we cannot measure and model. And here's another hard fact. The unique vantage point of space allows our satellites to provide continuous, large-scale, long-term, precise data about the state of our planet, also in regions that would be very difficult, if not impossible, to reach, if not from space. Think about polar regions, deserts, virgin forests, the oceans. Whether it's vulnerable coastal communities in Asia affected by sea level rise, or farmers in Africa impacted by drought or floods, our satellites can provide data where it is needed the most. It is our mission and ambition at the European Space Agency to do just that. Later this year, COP26 in Glasgow will be a moment of truth for the global community. It's within our reach to also make it a moment of increased action. And what if we could make a quantum leap when it comes to action? What if we could integrate all data into one system, basically a digital twin of Earth, to allow modeling of future climate, simulate different scenarios, the effects of different interventions, to predict and to prevent, and ultimately to protect our planet, our prosperity, our people. This is ESA's call to action. But caring for our planet does not stop at the edge of our thin atmosphere anymore. It also means caring for the very place where our space activities are flourishing the most, low Earth orbit, the vital orbital pathways around Earth. There is a problem brewing overhead. It's invisible to the naked eye, and it's still maybe not known to most people. Space debris threatens our future in space. Left unaddressed, Space debris will quickly become the dark side of this new space revolution. If we choose to tackle this problem right away, though, through effective international coordination and cooperation, the kind of cooperation that makes the International Space Station possible, we can ensure a long-term sustainable era of space exploration and exploitation. ESA is also at the forefront of this challenge. As I conclude my remarks, let me add one final point that is extremely dear to my heart. Thinking especially of the third pillar that we are discussing today, people. To be truly successful and effective, the new space revolution will have to be more inclusive than it has been so far. Starting from the digital divide that our telecommunication satellite can help to mitigate and to bridge, all the way to the skills and gender gap that we still have in the space sector. I will soon have the amazing opportunity of flying again for a second time to the International Space Station. And nothing makes me prouder than to think that I can also serve as a role model for our future generation of astronauts, space enthusiasts, but also scientists, engineers, and people at large who deeply care about the global challenges that we face as humanity. We need all talent to tackle those global challenges, and we need the hearts and minds of young people who truly perceive themselves as citizens of the world. I truly believe that living within the limit of our planet is a global challenge that requires humankind to act as one to preserve our home for generations to come. And we need that same collaboration mindset that drives our space exploration and built the International Space Station. This is the vision and ambition that Europe and the European Space Agency are working towards. We want to inspire progress and drive innovation. We want to take risks, but also do the responsible things. We want to approach the global challenges from that orbital perspective, remembering that we're all crew members on Spaceship Earth, not passengers, crew members, with the responsibility to roll up our sleeves and get the job done. As you work to tackle those global challenges, I encourage you, I urge you to take that orbital perspective and to remember that space can help. Make space part of your reflection process, make space part of your decision making, and make space part of our solutions. Thank you.
While listening to your incredible presentation, I was thinking, and I was looking at Professor Monti for help. I was thinking, how do you refer to an astronaut? Mrs. Astronaut? Dear astronaut? So let me say, since I don't know, thank you very much, dear Samantha. You may know that in the think tank community, a think tank to prove is successful keeps saying, I have a down-to-earth approach. You have proved with your vision from far away in the sky how limited and wrong we can be. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I appreciate your attention and your interest. Thank you so much.
And we now, you now move to your training for your next mission, and we now move to the next session. And I kindly invite Monica Maggioni and Professor Mantovani to reach Professor Monti on the floor.
Good afternoon and good evening, good morning to the global audience. It's a pleasure being here. And I'm afraid we're going to discuss something which is at the heart of everybody's life in this, especially in this last year. Pandemic has hit our societies, our lives, and we're still struggling as an international community to find the right solutions, to find the tools for everybody, to make sure that this pandemic isn't another factor of inequality all over the globe. So we will have the privilege to discuss all these issues with Agnes Binagwo, who's the Vice Chancellor of the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda. She will be with us from remote in a few seconds. With Professor Alberto Mantovani, who's the Scientific Director of Istituto Clinico Humanitas. He has an incredibly long career in the field. Presidente Monti, Professor Monti, now in the capacity as a chair of the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development for the WHO. Here, Mrs. Binagwo, it's a pleasure having you with us this afternoon. But first of all, before starting our discussion, we have a keynote address, and it's the keynote address of the Director General of the WHO, Tedros Ghebreyesus.
I would like to thank the Italian Institute for International Political Studies and Bocconi University for co-hosting this summit, and the government of Italy for its committed leadership of the G20. We are encouraged that in the declaration last month, the G20 health ministers expressed support for WHO's global target to vaccinate 40% of the population in every country by the end of this year. We hope that at their meeting this month, the G20 leaders will also support our target to vaccinate 70% of the population of every country by the middle of next year. To reach those targets, we need 2 billion doses for low and lower middle income countries right now. I appeal to leaders of countries and companies that control the global supply of vaccines to act immediately and put us on a path towards ending the pandemic. But of course, vaccines alone are not enough. Countries must continue to use public health and social measures along with diagnostics, support quarantine, and effective interventions such as medical oxygen. At the same time, we must learn the lessons the pandemic is teaching us. That means better governance and better financing for global health, and a sustainably financed WHO that's empowered to fulfill its role at the center of the global health architecture. And it means supporting countries to build resilient health systems based on strong primary health care. That is the best defense against health threats of all types, from outbreaks to diseases of all types, and to the existential threat of climate change. The pandemic has taken so much from us, but it's also giving us the opportunity to write a healthier, safer, fairer, and more sustainable future. I thank you.
Thank you to the Director General. A round of applause. Professor Binagwo, I'd like to start with you and address your question, because what we just heard, Director General was telling us vaccines are not enough. Okay, but in some places, like in Africa, vaccines is the first part of the problem, because we know that right now we have 8.4 doses per 100 people, which makes us look at the future in a very worried way. So would you please help us understanding a little better what's going on there and what are the perspectives?
First of all, thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to join you in this very, very important debate. And to give you a sense, I think that you start your remarks by saying, we hope that this COVID-19 is going to be another occasion for inequities. It's too late. It's already another occasion for inequities for a long time. And inside countries, because the most vulnerable suffer more, but also between high and low income countries. Why? Because the vaccine are, in the high income countries, they are blocking the supply chain of, they are blocking the fact that we can produce more vaccine, and they have blocked too long the possibility for Africa to create the vaccine because there is no more vaccine on, not enough vaccine on the market. And the rich countries are hoarding vaccine, they're stocking them. And it's because of that that there is no vaccine enough on the market. We have only vaccinated 3% of the African continent. And Europe has vaccinated more than 50%. But it's not because there is vaccine hesitancy in Africa. It's just because vaccines are not available. And another important thing that make me afraid is the greed of pharmaceutical companies. They have made already billions of profit, but they have recently increased the price, not for the low-income countries, for the developed countries, but soon we know it will come to us. In addition, if we can see that many of the African countries, the majority of them, will not reach the target of vaccinating 10% of their population this year, as it was planned a year ago. And this because there is no vaccine on the market. So this inequality exists. For example, in my country, a year ago, we pay in advance for 1 million, for almost 2 million doses. And we don't receive that. Why? Because a farmer gives preference to rich countries, even if they receive the money of low-income countries. They don't serve them as a priority, even if the vaccine they give is to go and be stocked in the storage in high-income countries, and even if they get the date of preemption there and they are thrown in the dustbin. Europe has already destroyed thousands and thousands and thousands of vaccines since July, just because they expire on shelf. So this is why I am scared, and this is why I found that this is a shaming situation, and this is also a dangerous situation that creates a favorable condition for variant to emerge. As Africa is not vaccinated, one day we may face, but Africa and other low-income countries, we may face the emergence of variants that no vaccine will be protecting against. So what is the matter to do this? It's against science, it's against logic, it's against morality, and also it's against self-protection, because stopping the pandemic should have been the motto of all the world, and not nationalistically stock vaccine in case of. Some countries have what it takes to vaccinate 5 times their population, when the rest of the world is at 3%. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I think it's so important, the kind of perspective you gave us. And this is why, Professor Mantovani, I think even the debate which is taking place in Europe, in our country, is so important. And this is why I mentioned you are the scientific director of Humanitas, but you're a member of the steering committee of Fondazione Cariplo, and you're working on, even on the perceptions about the pandemic. And we're fighting against spreading of fake news, We have seen people resisting to the vaccines, which is exactly the opposite situation in some ways, if compared to what we just heard.
Well, let me first say that I second what was said. It's a concern that I have because of moral points, because there is a general rule that when you run clinical trials in a community, you are supposed to give back to the community. And the trials were run in low-income countries. And finally, because their security is our security. And we have a challenge also of transforming a vaccine delivered there into a vaccination, which is not simple, the last mile. So I thought I should say that. Going back to your question, well, 2 weeks ago we had the Science 20 Summit in Rome. The Accademia dei Lincei organized that, and I should say that Giorgio...
Today it's a very nice day for them.
It's a fantastic day because the president, Giorgio Parisi, got the Nobel Prize for physics.
For physics.
So. And I mean, I want to emphasize that it was Giorgio Parisi who wanted to have the S20 together with the double S20, social science 20, because his perception and vision was that the social science and the hard science should go hand in hand against fake news and against dissemination. So fighting the fake news means taking advantage of social sciences and all we can learn from social science, number one. The second point is that I ask myself the question, so what, I mean, I echo a famous president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, what can I do against fake news? Or what we can do as a scientific community? Well, I feel that in addition to the usual communication we have to go to the schools. I mean, tonight I'm going to lecture to lay people, to schools, trade unions. I lectured in trade unions. I think we have to do what I would call molecular dissemination. And Fondazione Cariplo is actively engaged in bridging social science and hard science. Finally, I think we should try and convey, among the many things that we should try and convey, the sense of the danger of not acting. I give you an example. I mean, all the major countries are now engaged in a third dose of the vaccine for the frail people. I underline the point, for the frail people. And of course, we have limited information on that. But it would be very dangerous not acting. People call on us and say, well, we have no guarantee that the messenger RNA vaccines don't have long-term effects. Well, we are reasonably sure there is no long-term effect. And it would be very dangerous not to act. So we should convey the message that under certain conditions, there is a danger of not acting. So those are my 3 reflections on those points.
Which tells us that we have to act, and this is why I'm going to Professor Monti. Presidente, in the commission you're chairing, you're focusing on the solutions and on the new procedures that have to be implemented to respond to health needs. In some ways, this pandemic got us by surprise, and this shouldn't happen again. So you're studying on this. So what are the recommendations out there?
Thank you, Monica. I believe that our work, which is not the work of pure scientists, but is the work of a widely diverse commission composed of scientists in the hard sense, economists, stakeholders of health systems, and former heads of states and governments, wanted to look at the lessons to be drawn from the pandemic in view of finding a new strategy for health and sustainable development. And we come up with a number of, I believe, concrete recommendations which form part of a new, bold strategy for health and sustainable development. To do so, we have to mentally and practically and operationally achieve two steps. I'm saying things that to Professor Mantovani will no doubt appear to be trivialities, but this is not always the case for the general public. The first step is to fully adopt and make operational the so-called One Health approach. So to be aware that the connections between the health of humans, of animals, of plants, and of the planet, be it in terms of environment, biodiversity, climate change, is crucial, and that no compartmentalized solution can be achieved unless there is the holistic approach. Okay, this is the One Health approach, which has a number of organizational and institutional repercussions. For example, in the UN family, there are 4 separate agencies caring for the health of these 4 entities. They need, in our recommendations, to work much more in a coordinated manner. But that is not enough. We come to the conclusion that it is also necessary to have a second step, namely to marry this One Health policy with all the other key policies, even far away, apparently, from health. For example, economic and financial policies, of course, intellectual property policies, investment policies, international policies, and so on. And it is only if health, already beefed up by itself as a One Health approach, comes to permeate these other policies and to be in turn permeated, that far-reaching solutions and sustainable solutions can be achieved. This may look to be a bit abstract, but this really means putting together different competences and different powers in the institutions. And I believe that with this second step, One Health, but also immersed into the general policies, we come close, I believe, I'm not an expert of this, but I believe we come close to what Professor Ilaria Capua, who will speak here tomorrow, calls in a recent book circular health, which is One Health augmented with more intersections with these other policies. Maybe in your second question, because I've spoken too long, I can give some concrete examples of where this brings us to.
Very good. Thank you so very much, because this gives us a perspective. It's a different approach. It's a different way to tackle the health issue. And on this, even the T20 task force worked these days, and I think we can see a video in which we can get the contribution from the T20.
recommend that the G20 countries commit themselves to adopting national health policies to deliver quality health care through a balanced model that incorporates hospital-centered and decentralized community-based approaches, and to invest in the education and training of a more robust health workforce. The One Health strategy should be implemented by adopting a One Health-based conceptual framework. We recommend establishing a new independent science-led reporting of pathogens and other emerging health threats. Researchers should be able and incentivized to share information in a peer-to-peer network free of political constraints. Schools do not drive COVID outbreak if mitigation measures are in place. Therefore, we recommend that in the future, schools remain open unless the closure is deemed essential as an ultimate measure to control a pandemic. Last, global health equity. To achieve this, we recommend establishing a global health equity observatory that provides data on health inequity within and between countries and the underlying drivers. However, data will be insufficient without complementary systems of global accountability and periodic reporting to institutional mechanisms and bodies.
Very clear, and I'd like on this recommendation to go back to Rwanda, to Professor Binagwa, because Professor, I can read the sign of your university, which is Global Health University, and you mentioned also equity. I see all the elements there. So if we want to go back for a second to Africa and the vaccine campaign, what could you recommend? What could you ask for?
So what I could ask for, I would ask many things, but let's start by what is going on, meaning availability of vaccine on the markets. You ask me what I ask compared to One Health or what I ask in general? Sorry for...
I'm sorry, there was someone talking to me at the same time, but I was asking you to share with us your vision about what is needed to have Africa progress on the vaccination campaign and make sure that more people are on the safe side.
Okay, thank you. I want to be sure because the previous great video we saw is about a very essential subject, what is One Health. For Africa to be able to vaccinate its population, first of all, it's true that vaccine hesitancy is a problem that can be everywhere. But in Africa, it's not the problem because 3% are vaccinated. And a study done by CDC Africa shows us that 80% of Africans want to be vaccinated. So we should leave vaccine hesitancy now and focus on the gaps. The other thing, there are some countries that are ready. My country is ready. You can bring vaccine that will be given without waste anything. There are some countries who need support. And at the beginning, COVAX was also supposed to give that. So many countries did an effort to equip themselves in new cold chain if were needed, because it was supposed to come with COVAX. So we should help countries who are not ready to distribute in a safe manner quality vaccine in a quality manner. But for countries who are ready, and there are more than one, we should stop rich countries who are holding vaccine to continue and distribute. You know that at the end of this year, the rich country will have more than 1 billion doses in excess in their stock. So this is something to do. Second, increase the capacity to produce where vaccines are already produced. And the European Union, or at least some countries from Europe, has stopped that to happen. Third, waive the TRIPS. I just want to say that even if the European Union has waived the TRIPS, we have countries, of course, they are not in the European Union, but they are in Europe, like UK, who block it systematically. While a proper framework for licensing will allow Africa to produce quality vaccine, why the people who have invented, and don't forget the majority have invented with public money and make profit by their own. So those who have invented can still make money out of their invention. Third, we need new partnership for helping Africa to produce quickly the vaccine. And this is in education, in infrastructure, and for some countries, as I said, disseminate what will be produced. So these are things, building human resource, the necessity infrastructure, support the private sector in Africa because they never invest in that and they need to be reassured how to do that, and strengthen the regulatory system. And this is not complicated, you know. I can just copy what Italy has done and adapt that to my context. So it's not rocket science. And
it can be done. So your message basically is it can be done. So it's just a matter of choices.
Not only can, should be.
And it should be done. Let me go on this to Professor Mantovani, because there's a call for action here, and what we see is that there is a need for a global solidarity. But on the other hand, and she was mentioning that, there is a key element, which is this collaboration among, you know, private people and public institutions that have been one of the keys of the solution here, and that can be much more for the future.
So, well, first of all, let's have a reflection on what happened. I mean, we had at light speed, we had new vaccine platforms, the Adhanom virus platform, the messenger RNA platform, and that was thanks to high-risk fundamental research. And I want to emphasize, in the last week I had conversation with Kathleen Carrico, the mother together with Weissman of the messenger RNA platform, and today with Christoph Huber, one of the fathers coming from oncology of BioNTech. And we need to have high-risk fundamental research. For instance, the charity Fondazione Cariplo, together with Teleton, is now funding research in the ignome. 20% of the information encoded by the genome, we really don't know what it does. So that's number one. The second point, during the pandemic, we have had fantastic results by integrating fundamental academic research, be it private, this university here, our university, or public. Fundamental research, small biotech, big biotech, and national healthcare service. So those are, that has been key, and we need to improve some of the rules and soften some of the rules. We have had experience of that, and that has been key. The third point that I would stress is that national healthcare service. My dream is to have the national healthcare service as a lab that addresses important questions for the public. And there are examples for that. The recovery platform in the UK. I mean, we have learned amazing things, both in terms of low-cost interventions and providing a platform for industry, for testing what really works and what doesn't work. And it's important to learn from that. So those are my points.
Going to another point, Professor Monti, in your commission report, you proposed to the G20 the idea of a health board. So on one hand, you told us we need to change the approach and see it as a One Health approach. On the other hand, you're suggesting this institution. Why? Why do we need a new institution to address this issue?
Well, to put the global order in a better position vis-à-vis pandemics or health threats in general, we believe, first of all, as almost everybody does, that WHO should be strengthened, given more powers vis-à-vis member states, given a more robust financial structure, reducing, at least in percentage terms, its dependence on private donations, on foundations, and so on. But we believe that although the WHO should keep all the powers in terms of health contents, it cannot deliver all that is needed for a stronger set of health systems unless there is more proximity between the world of health and the world of finance. Managing Director Georgieva reminded us a moment ago that the fight against climate change gained momentum when it ceased to be a sectoral issue for environment ministers and became an issue at the center of the table of councils of ministers. Exactly the same thing applies for health ministers. In our commission, there were, as I said, 5 former heads of states or governments, and I had my own experience for a short time. In normal times, health policy is a very important policy, but peripheral. It comes up and to be the only policy that concentrates the minds of heads of governments when there is a crisis like this. And then they focus on this, and they also make good decisions. But suppose that 1 year from now, when the G20 meets under Indonesian presidency, there is no longer the pandemic as #1 reason for concern of the heads of governments, but some fallout from Afghanistan, or the issue of cybersecurity or some catastrophe of other sorts. Be sure that unless there is a small but permanent structure which crystallizes this momentum of attention now and forces the heads of governments to keep also this in mind for a long time, then this interest, #1 topic, will be ephemeral. And since we are convinced, and we show in the report, but also many other reports show that this fight requires fundamental changes, not only in the health sector, but also outside of it. And these fundamental changes are long-term investments and long-term changes in mentality. That's why we say, why doesn't the G20? Of course, Professor Binakvao, a G20 plus. The G20 is originally composed of mainly rich countries, but it has already been able on some occasions to open up to other parts of the world, which will be particularly essential in this case. So an enlarged G20 could provide the table for a permanent intimacy between finance ministers and health ministers under the supervision of heads of governments, and therefore ensure that there is also a greater predisposition of governments to finance WHO and its needs. And let me just add one remark here, Madam Chair. How did this small idea, but I hope it will fly, come to my mind a few months ago and was adopted in our report? Well, in 2009, the world lost another global public good. Public health is a global public good which was lost now. That time, it was less dramatic to ordinary people, but equally catastrophic to the global economy. The global good, public good that was lost was financial stability. You remember the big crisis. What did the G20 under British presidency do in 2009? They decided to set up a financial stability board. By the way, the first chair of that board was the man who now chairs the overall G20 exercise, Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi. So there is also this elegant historical recurrence. And they worked to give new guidelines to the legislative authorities of all the world. And so far, we have not had a second financial crisis of that sort. So let's try to read into history, and of course, the Secretariat should be with the WHO. The WHO Director General should be a prominent member of this board. So not much duplication, but a big leverage and multiplier.
In some ways, let me put it like this. It's a chance that this incredible nightmare that we've been through can give us a new tool that makes us a little stronger for the future.
And I believe it was not a bad idea for WHO Europe, which set up this commission, because unless you call on people who live out of the box, you cannot have ideas which may be good or bad, history will tell, but ideas which are a bit out of the box themselves, like this one.
This is very important. It's a time in which thinking out of the box is needed, is one of the key factors, and this is why we will move forward and speak about climate change, because what we just heard about One Health is deeply and strongly connected with this idea of climate change. Join me in a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Professor from Rwanda. Thank you, Presidente Monti, and thank you, Professor Mantovani. So we now move towards, again, global change, climate change, and ecological transition. Thank you very much. Here we are. I couldn't leave the stage just because I'm supposed to talk to Minister Cingolani, that should appear on the screen.
From here.
I can hear his voice. Here he is. Good afternoon, Minister Cingolani. We are connected to a global audience, and we were just speaking about health and the idea of One Health, but starting from One Health and going to the planet prosperity goes through the discussion about the ecological transition, which is exactly your task and what you're trying to achieve. So let me just ask you an information, first of all. What could you achieve till now in the G20 as when it comes to fighting the climate change? Is there any real result out there?
Yeah, besides the headache There's plenty of results. I would say, first of all, this year we had for the first time a G20 getting together environment and energy. That's non-trivial because normally the two issues have been treated as completely separated, which is no longer, doesn't make any sense any longer at the moment. It's clear that they have to be treated together. In Naples, when we had the G20, the environmental G20 was concluded successfully, having a communique consisting of 25 points that were shared unanimously by all the participants. In a few words, that was recovering the concept of nature-based solutions applied to many environmental issues, and there was full agreement among all the parties. The second G20 was the energy one. That consisted of approximately 60 resolutions, 60 points. 58 were agreed completely, and 2 were left for the forthcoming G20 of the prime ministers. And there is a specific reason. What was very important in this G20 energy was that all countries, including those traditionally against the transition, shared and agreed about the idea of respecting the Paris Agreement. So just trying to keep below 2 centigrades the temperature rise by the end of the century. But in there we had a difference because some of the countries, the most active countries, were pushing to accelerate during the decade, trying to reach 1.5 as a target, and not 2 centigrades. I mean, the difference of half degree centigrades is quite substantial in terms of global atmospheric chemistry and atmospheric composition and impact on the weather. At that time, accelerating too much on this temperature would have meant a lot of social and industrial change, especially for big countries such as China and India with huge populations, and also the policy of the incentives for coal-based or fossil fuel-based activities were questioned. So since this impact was too much social rather than only climatological, we decided to shift those two, to upshift and forward those 2 issues to the G20 of the prime ministers. But yet I would say 25 out of 25 in the environment and 58 out of 60 on the energy was really an unexpected success, primarily because all countries decided, okay, we follow the Paris Agreement. I mean, 1 year before, this would have been a complete dream.
Let me just go for a second out of the already decided pattern and ask you, you're not a politician by life. You spent an entire life as a scientist. What are the difficulties you're finding in these talks that you couldn't even imagine before? Is there anything new? Is there anything that you really couldn't expect?
Well, okay. Due to the very international character of the career of the scientist, I think I had an advantage in talking and working simultaneously with a community of people coming from 20 different countries. So it was very helpful for me, the previous experience of talking many languages and knowing pretty much the attitude, how different people approach problems. So this helps. On the other hand, the drawback is that for a technical education like mine, sometimes it's hard to understand the subtle understatement of the politics. So I tend to be very technical. Sometimes rule 2 + 2 = 4, and I don't see how it can be 4.5 or 3.5. So this sometimes doesn't help. But generally speaking, I think at the international level, there's not such a big problem. I mean, it's I found the story relatively manageable. I don't say easy, but we could make it.
You're, it's not so easy to listen to someone saying we can make it, talking about climate change. Let me just go back to what is going on in the framework of G20. And this year, there is a clear thread that takes us from G20 to COP26, and it will be Glasgow. Can you see and can you tell us what are the achievements that in some ways are paving the way towards Glasgow?
Yeah. So guys, I have to be very frank. I think one of the most important contribution due to the Italian leadership stands in a totally new way of facing the problem of climate change versus global inequalities. I think we did push a lot over the last months, starting with the G20, insisting on the fact that there's no point to treat separately global inequalities and climate change. I mean, to make it very clear, the G20 deals with 4.8 billion people producing 80% of the greenhouse gases approximately. But we should not forget we're leaving outside of the count 3 billion people producing a marginal amount of greenhouse gas. And out of those 3 billion people, we have about 1 billion people having no access to electricity, and most of the 3 billions having no access to clean fuel for cooking. So even the concept itself of ecological transition changed on whether you consider this, you define this in the G20 country or in any other country outside the G20. That is exactly the COP26. COP26 is embodying more than 190 countries. G20 is 20 countries. So the way we discuss, the way we conceive a plan, the way we develop a strategy for a G20 country, it cannot be similar to the strategy developed for any vulnerable country in the COP26. This is fundamental. How can we talk about electric mobility or hydrogen in a country where there is no electricity available to the citizen? This was, I mean, I think everybody knew this, but for the first time ever, this was finally put together. And in the pre-COP work we did in Milan recently, even with the Youth for Climate, and then with the ministerial pre-COP meeting of last week, that appeared very clear. So what do we expect as a message for the COP26? Number one, we all agree about the strategy to decarbonize. We all know that there are tricks we have to develop, just like changing electricity, swapping electricity into renewable, electrifying manufacturing, changing mobility, restoring natural environment for carbon trapping, boosting circular economy, and in general, waste cycle. So we all agree with that. But on the other hand, we should not stop creating funds to reduce the gap with the underdeveloped countries and the vulnerable countries. The G20 promised 100 billions per year to the vulnerable countries. We hardly reached 60 before the COVID. So first of all, we have to reach the 100 billion. This is really the minimum, is the sort of metabolic support. And we all know, everybody agreed during the ministerial and the pre-COP last week that the 100 billions should act like a leverage to reach the trillion financial aid, which is actually needed by the vulnerable countries. So it's a factor of 10 leverage. This can only be accomplished by a proper public-private partnership. The public should put the spark into the fire, and then the private should support and grow the financial aid. Otherwise, we will not reduce the differences. The second issue, I think everybody agrees now. The Chinese government also confirmed that we are all aware that the 2 degrees is too much. The IPCC report has shown that we are already late, so we have to accelerate. This decade is fundamental. We have to keep the concept of 1.5 degrees alive. So increasing the temperature by not more than 1.5. This is an extra effort, it's an extra challenge. We all have to work about this challenge. Those 2 pillars are really fundamental. And then, of course, we talk about adaptation. That has to be faster. We talk about transparency in the nationally disclosed carbon activities. That actually we should give transparent number, and the number should be certified if we want to make global statistics about the status of the environment. We should accelerate the Santiago Protocol to help vulnerable countries after catastrophic event. I mean, having a storm in Haiti is totally different than having a storm in Finland. So we should adapt our response time to the actual need and vulnerability of the countries. Those are some of the issues we were preparing at the pre-COP, and I think in Glasgow at the COP26, those things have to become decisions and have to be forwarded to the next COP.
Thank you so much, Minister. Let me put it like this. The entire process has to be sustainable and not just a goal. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We know that you're in a meeting with all the other ministers of the government, so thank you even more for participating to this T20. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Minister Cingolani.
Bye-bye.
So the long day is over, and tomorrow is going to be the last T20 day, and they tell me that the appointment is tomorrow at 2 o'clock Italian time. Everybody else has to calculate what time it's going to be. Have a great evening, and thank you so very much.